thanking and praising God for the way that he reminds us of important things. Let's call this last chapter of Luke, Luke chapter 24, remember, because the word is literally going to come up in that first section of the chapter, running roughly the first 12 verses, as we might have mentioned in the previous chapter, chapter 23. First section that talks about the attempts to add spices to the burial of the Christ by the women who were worried about who was going to roll away the stone. And as we realize, that was a needless concern, because as they go to the tomb, they're going to be addressed by two men, quite likely angels, even though they are not literally called angels in Luke's description. But they are going to challenge the women to consider, why should they seek the living from among the dead, understanding that he is no longer in the tomb, he has risen. Understanding that they are going to go on to encourage them in verse 6. He is not here, but he has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the third day rise. A famous statement. If you've heard the resurrection story before, you've probably heard that, but the thing that caught my attention was the way in which that call to remember seems to run the entire structure of the chapter, understanding that the women are not going to be the only ones that are going to be called to remember things that they were told about the ministry, including the death and resurrection of Christ, as they are going to go and tell those who are described as, the 11 and the rest in verse 9, all these things, but it's going to seem to those who they tell like an idle thing. Peter, however, is going to go at least try to investigate for himself, but seeing the tomb empty, he's going to still seem to be perplexed. As the next section of the chapter, verses 13 through 35, are going to describe how Jesus is going to encounter two of those described as the rest, I'm guessing in verse 9, on the road to Emmaus, as they are walking and discussing the things that have happened surrounding his crucifixion. As he encounters them, he is going to ask them what they are talking about, as they are, point that stands out to me in verse 17, are going to say to him, looking sad, are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who has not heard of the things that have happened in these days? Reminding me of quite possibly the best sermon I ever heard preached on this passage. It seemed to really personify these two sad men who had lost their friend. Not that the chapter gives us a whole lot of insight into their personal relationship with Christ, but the thing that sermon helped me to understand is they just genuinely seem to care. And so sometimes those are the things that can get lost in analyzing a passage or just reading it or whatever. And for whatever reason, because of that sermon in a lot of ways, just has me looking at that phrase, looking sad, a whole different way than I did before. I was encouraged to pause and really take in what they were going through as they were walking on the road. In some ways, dejected, maybe even hopeless. But Jesus is about to personally encourage them, as verse 16 is going to say, their eyes were kept from recognizing him, only to have them opened in verse 31. But in between, there is going to be a conversation where he is going to help them understand by, in verse 25, calling them to recall all that the prophets have spoken. And then saying, was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? Not seeming to teach them things afresh, but to draw on or remember things that they already were familiar with, or at least had seen before from the prophets. Of course, that's my paraphrase. It doesn't literally say remember, but he does seem to be drawing on things that they already knew, in much the same way that the men or the angels specifically called the women who had gone to the tomb to dress his body with spices, called them to remember the things that had been foretold about these times. As they are not going to be the only ones, because once their eyes are open in verse 31, they are going to likewise go on to tell the 11 and the rest. But before the rest, or the 11 and the rest, can doubt them, Jesus is actually going to make an appearance to those to whom they are trying to explain that he is actually alive, beginning in verse 36, running down through roughly about 49. He is going to make an appearance, but they aren't even going to believe him when they actually see him, because they are going to simply think that he is a spirit. And so he is then going to take steps to help them believe that he is really him. Going on in verse 38, it's going to say, and he said to them, why are you troubled and why do doubts arise in your hearts? See my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have, as he is going to go on to show them his hands and his feet, as he is additionally going to ask if they have anything to eat. Eating so that they can believe that he is physically there with them, as in verse 42, he eats a piece of fish, or verses 42 and 43, he eats a piece of fish that they had given to him, as verses 44 through 49 are going to go even further, as we said, to say, these are my words that I spoke to you. Once again, drawing on their recollection or their remembrance of things that he had already spoken to them directly. And likewise, as it was in verse 46, thus it is written that the Christ should suffer and on the third day rise from the dead. And then likewise, of course, that's drawing on the things that had been foretold about his death and resurrection, drawing, as we mentioned, or seeming to draw on that through line that the women who went to the tomb perplexed about what they saw, meaning nobody in the tomb, were called to remember the things that they had already been told about this moment. Likewise, the two others, or two of the rest on the road to Emmaus, when Jesus himself appeared to them, calling them to remember the things that had already been told to them about this moment in time, pointing forward to his appearance to the 11 and the rest, helping them to overcome the doubts that lingered even after they saw him, that helped them to realize not only was he there physically with all the evidence that he gave them, that he was actually there in the flesh and not just a spirit, but he built onto that their remembrance of all the things that had been told about this moment in time that they were existing in, reminding me that in life, especially as I find myself saying more and more, in times like this, the reality of life can often drive to the back of our minds things that we once remembered clearly. And so understand that as Christ is encouraging his own disciples, that God willing, his words will encourage us too, that no matter how overwhelming the moment may seem, God has the ability to restore to our memory the things that we need to move forward effectively, because that's exactly what he's doing for the apostles and his disciples here. He is not simply encouraging them, he's encouraging them about the things that they still have left to look forward to. So as we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me, that no matter how overwhelming things might seem right now, that God simply make the most of things that we already know in order to move us beyond whatever difficulties we are facing right now and into the things that we still have to look forward to.